final panel of the conference, 1995-1996 year of decision. And I want to open this panel with a contribution from political prisoner Paul Gallagher, which is entitled Newt, A Fable of Crime. Lock them up, the lady said. She felt she knew her mind as she left the special voting booth for the deaf, the dumb, and the blind. 2001 was over and done. The electorate so declined that the booth that shows you how to vote was almost the only kind. The nation's awful time was past. The tough calls had been made. The shocking memories of Newt had just begun to fade. 1,000 towns were leveled down. The children never played. But folks still felt they weren't safe from the predators that preyed. Inspired by Newt, we'd locked them up and thrown the key away, so the predators would learn the score, and the pizza thieves did pay. Oh, the drugs still flew by Ollie's crew, but the users had no say. And as the millions were locked up, we trusted there they'd stay. But things did not go as we liked, for grave were the nation's ills. So many criminals were locked up we couldn't pay the bills. Newt hadn't spoken of states gone broke, but of states' rights, popular wills. We said, this isn't what we want, and swallowed bitter pills. Phil Graham said, no, don't let them go. We'll make them factory slaves. And thus the more we lock them up, the more the nation saves. They'll make our glasses and cover our asses with trousers and make our staves, and if they're shackled properly, they can even dig our graves. And so we would have done it all at the cost of all our spoil. We threw our own selves out of work just to see those felons toil. But the shop for clocks made socks and rocks, and the trousers come out oiled, and we saw that it wasn't what we want, just an even bigger coil. But still the fiends by numbers grew. The nation's ills were worse. Can't let them out, spoke Newt and Graham. Our neighborhoods they'll curse. Life in thrall for each and all, and their kin shall reimburse us righteous with what we demand, and the nation's ills reverse. And so we would have done it all. For safety we were mad. And now the keepers did revolt, and demanded all we had. They feared, abhorred the captive horde, from the veteran to the lad. Again, this wasn't what we want. 2 million guards gone bad. This is our future, now said Newt, and another wife he wed. We'll fire 2 million coward guards and have every prisoner's head. Now all crimes, all will be capital. I say what must be said, and all our costs will be as none, and all transgressors dead. And so we would have done at once, for those were awful times. We fired 2 million coward guards, with death for all their crimes. Then said Phil Graham, skunk that I am, Newt's answer is sublime. Our prisons must remove the cost of all these lifetimes. And then we would have done it all. For savings we were crazed. And now did millions of police rebel and wild things raised. They were in awe to be the law. There was no price that pays. So further still from what we want, it left us sore amazed. Now Newt rose up. This cannot be. This is our way of life. Then heard he Bertrand Russell's words on peace through savage strife. And this he likes. Yes, nuclear strikes, he told his newest wife. Just there you'll see, selectively, just like my budget knife. And so the awful memory of Newt did quickly fade. We know he wasn't what we want, and of Graham no more be said. The drugs that flew by Ollie's crew we no longer call free trade, but still the crippling costs are those that for our votes we paid. Paul Gallagher. In a July 23rd column in the Hollinger Corporation's London Sunday Telegraph, quintessential British Tory Sir Peregrine Worsthorne endorsed U.S. House Speaker Newton Gingrich as the man to establish a police state in the United States. Under the title, "A Police State Beats a Welfare State," the British Lord said, "Newt Gingrich's approach strikes me as much more honest than British Labour Party head Tony Blair's, brutally honest. No nonsense, how the state can guarantee security in a revolutionary age. He simply takes for granted that we can do nothing much except one most important negative thing. It can promise not to get in the way of those who have a mind to fight for their own survival. The only responsible thing the state can do is to remove obstacles to the individual's own search for security. I am not suggesting we are going to have to move straight from a welfare state to the police state, but such a suggestion is far nearer the mark than all the alternative systems of welfare. In revolutionary times, the only form of security for property and the bourgeoisie comes not from think tanks, but from tanks proper. Gingrich, like Richard Nixon, wields a mailed fist, much disguised in an ideological glove, but clear enough for any but the blind to see. That is the real strength of the new politics in America. This endorsement by a representative of the British oligarchy, which has been echoed by fellow oligarchical spokesman Lord William Rees-Mogg, should not be surprising. Gingrich's ideas, such as they are, have been fashioned for him by a series of think tanks whose key personnel are British fascists from the school of the Mont Pelerin Society and Friedrich von Hayek. The Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Reason Foundation, the Adam Smith Institute, the Atlas Research Foundation, and the Institute of Economic Affairs are all devil fathers, to borrow a phrase from Mr. LaRouche, of Gingrich's Contract on America. London is praising its own work, and it knows that its fascist programs, if rammed through, will accomplish its long-standing aim of destroying the United States. But unfortunately, defeating Gingrich is not as easy as simply exposing his role for the British. You would think that the 52-year-old, baby-faced, blow-dried Gingrich wouldn't be a great threat. After all, as the popular press has reported correctly for months, if not years, this guy is pure sleaze. He's a buffoon, a chameleon, an opportunist, a womanizer, someone who won't hesitate to kick out his wife if she's not young and pretty enough to be in the White House. While trumpeting himself as an intellectual, Gingrich cannot write anything but a garbage can full of advertising slogans. Aren't Americans smart enough to see through this guy? That question remains to be answered. We have gotten a very good response to the first salvo put out by New Federalist against Gingrich's contract. Over 2 million copies of this pamphlet are currently circulating, with increasing numbers taken by constituency leaders in Labor and the Democratic Party. But the populist style of Gingrich does make him extremely dangerous, because Americans have shown again and again their propensity to fall for such snake oil. And by the time our neighbors wake up, it may be too late. Through the course of this panel, we're going to unmask the intellectual frauds that permit Newty to present himself as the savior of American civilization. Graham Lowry will expose his reliance on the radical British empiricist school of Bernard Mandeville. Linda de Hoyos will show that his revolutionary model is more appropriate to the French, not American Revolution. Jeff Steinberg will demonstrate that his economics come from the free trade school which created modern fascism. Dennis Speed will show you how Newt's self-proclaimed fight against the counterculture really reinforces the libertarian nihilist approach. And Ed Spanis will demonstrate how the program to renew America will actually destroy America. All of Newt's so-called ideas come from an anti-American British empiricist tradition of the same sort that created Nazism, but they have a pseudo-modern twist, that of the New Age. Actually, this New Age ideology is not new at all. Its methodology is as old as Dionysius and Aristotle, and we will proceed to unmask it. In a major study of fascism, presented in early 1982, Helga Zepp-LaRouche exposed the conservative revolution and provided a crucial framework for unmasking the New Age fascists of today. While she was addressing primarily the green environmentalist development in Europe at the time, the analysis is equally applicable to the U.S. situation today. I quote, "In a first approximation, it can be said that fascism and its precursors were characterized by the following principle-defining characteristics. 1. Malthusian or racially motivated genocide. 2. Fascist economic policy. 3. A fascist mass movement. And 4. A fascist elite, which controlled that mass movement without that movement necessarily being conscious of the fact." The first point needs no elaboration, but the rest do. The essence of a fascist economic policy has been exposed by our movement for more than 25 years now, as centering on the reduction of living standards below the level at which life can be sustained. The dramatic endpoint of such a policy is the looting of life itself in the concentration camps, where prisoners are forced to expend more calories in work than they are given to eat. This policy is describable as primitive accumulation, which prioritizes the desires and needs of an elite over the requirements of life for the nation, on the implicit, or in some cases explicit, assumption that the bulk of the population is not fully human. A fascist mass movement is describable in terms of a mob, manipulable by rhetoric or other emotional appeals into demands for immediate gratification. This phenomenon goes back to ancient times, as we saw in Rome and other empires. It also makes itself evident in culture, in a celebration of bestiality, extremes of sensation, irrationality, existentialism, not to mention the blood and circuses of the Roman imperial type. A fascist elite is fundamentally an oligarchy committed to preserving its life and death power over the rest of humanity, and resting its authority on its position of power, rather than on clear and sufficient reason. As in the case of Hitler's regime, this elite is not necessarily willing to associate itself with its creation. In the 1930s, that elite was an international club, which was centered in London and New York, as well as on the European continent. Clearly, all these phenomena exist today in latent form, especially through the genocidal economic policies of the International Monetary Fund and the deliberate plans for world depopulation coming from the London-centered Club of the Isles, headed by Prince Philip. But the fascists have not consolidated power, in the sense that they have not yet destroyed barriers to their program and created the kind of mass support they would need to do so. The nut which they have to crack for their world strategic plans is the United States. And the nut who's volunteered to do the job is Newt Gingrich. What does Newt stand for? Newt talks a lot, and he admits that his brain is not always connected when he does so. But recently the speaker, or shall we say the squeaker, has produced a book which presumably he stands by. To Renew America is already a hot seller, and Newt is expecting to make a lot of money on it. Mercifully, it's only about 250 pages long. Newt says over and over again that his identity is that of a revolutionary who wants to rebuild or renew American civilization. He also claims that romantic idealism is at the heart of America, and that he wants to restore that while giving every citizen an opportunity to pursue happiness. I don't know which lady that is. Over and over again, you hear him quote the Declaration of Independence on the, quote, unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while noting that it's the pursuit you are promised, not happiness itself. But what does being a revolutionary mean to history professor Newt Gingrich? From reading a wide swath of his writings, I can assure you that it basically means destruction. Newt's revolution would pull down the existing government and then let everyone fend for himself, Sounds like what Worsthorne said, right? Interestingly enough, even Newt's discussion of the American Revolution contains virtually no mention of the fact that it was the British monarchy which the Americans revolted against, and which, as even the ignorant know, was the mortal enemy of this republic through the War of 1812 and beyond. And what is what Newt calls American civilization? This is a concept which certainly didn't exist for the American founding fathers. They thought they were carrying out a noble experiment in republicanism, which carried forward the ideas of Western Christian civilization. An American system? Yes. An American civilization? No. This second phrase likely came into U.S. parlance in the late 19th century, when a movement of what was called American exceptionalism was shaped, building toward what American sponsors of Teddy Roosevelt would call an American empire. It reflects a chauvinism and narrowness which denies the best which this republic has always represented for mankind, the tradition arising from the Italian Golden Renaissance. The fact that Gingrich's idea of American civilization is a fraud is evident throughout his speeches. When he spoke of the problems our nation faces at a July 18, 1995 speech at Georgetown CSIS, he indicated that his models were none other than the British and Roman empires. I quote, "If you go back and study the rise of the British Empire, say from Pitt the Elder through 1815, they stumbled around a lot too. If you go back and study the Romans and the late phases of the Republic, when they were first becoming a dominant power, it is amazing how often they messed up, and how many armies they lost, and how many fleets they lost. By their standards, we've done nothing that's a significant problem." By their standards. Newt's description of America as romantic is also revealing. Interestingly enough, his description of this in his book comes out as in a story discussing public opinion polling, something he's more interested in than truth. Quote, "I began to realize the degree to which America must be described in romantic terms," he writes. "To take the romance out of America is to de-Americanize our own country. To me, America is a romance in which we all partake." Sound attractive? It shouldn't. Romanticism is a philosophy of irrationalism, which has everything to do with rejecting the creative powers of reason in the human mind and celebrating the unmoored emotions. It's magic. It's entrancing. It's a pathway to being manipulated by the cool, calculating fascist elite. In Newt's case, it also seems to have led to not a few sordid affairs. Just American nature, he might say. The Squeaker's paeans to the unalienable rights of the Declaration of Independence are also fraudulent. He correctly notes that Jefferson originally wrote the right to life, liberty, and property, a formulation which can be traced to that oligarchical apologist creep, John Locke. But instead of recognizing the antagonism of these two ideas, Newt asserts that Jefferson used happiness as just another word for property. This phrase is then used by Newt to apotheosize the private sector. As he said in the piece published in March 1995 by Family Voice, a publication of Concerned Women of America, quote, "The whole notion of markets is the best way of allocating resources, creating the future rapidly, and encouraging people to become prosperous." What he means by unalienable rights, therefore, is that you get a chance to fight for property. Meanwhile, Newt will get government off your back, except perhaps for some tax credits that will let you buy a laptop computer. Now, as I said earlier on, it would be a mistake to try to make Newt too coherent. He is a creature of ambition, seeking to get funding and manipulate popular support. He wants that support from the left, from the right, from the enraged, and above all from the rich. If you hate the state, if you hate industrial society, or if you just hate certain Democrats, Newt says that he's your champion. It's the fascist elite above Newt who are coherent and deadly so. But Newt cloaks himself in the American flag, in the rights of the individual, in the demand for school prayer and God in the schools, and so forth. Let's rip more of the mask away. To renew America is organized around 6 major goals. The first is, quote, we must assert and renew American civilization, unquote. Under this rubric, Newt argues that the country has been under assault by the counterculture since 1965. This is true. But not only does Newt not identify the source of this assault as an act of British cultural warfare, but he embraces amoral libertarianism, feel-good personal morality, as the alternative. Now, Newt himself knows a little about the counterculture, coming from the 60s generation. A recent unauthorized biography called Newt Gingrich, Speaker to America, reports his big political act at Tulane University, where he was a graduate student, was to have been leading a week-long student protest demanding that some obscene photographs, and I do mean obscene, be included in an issue of the campus newspaper. He did it just on the principle of free speech, a friend told the authors, and probably never even looked at the pictures. If this is freedom, what does this renewing American civilization mean in action? In action, we see in the Congress. It means kicking out immigrants, taking down government programs for the poor and sick, turning our back on the rest of the world, and letting the looting begin without restraint. The second major goal, in fact, demonstrates that Newt has no problem with the counterculture at all, in any principled way. For it reads, quote, we must accelerate America's entry into the third wave information age, unquote. The third wave information age is the guts of the counterculture, based on the same premises that led to the hedonistic glorification of rock noise, drugs, and sex. The takeoff of environmentalism, the mass propaganda campaign for the depopulation lobby, and the rapid and deliberate destruction of the industrial and scientific base of the United States. Gingrich's every speech glorifies the third wave, a phrase taken from a 1980 book by futurist Alvin Toffler. A perusal of Toffler's books, including his early 1970s mass international bestseller, Future Shock, and the recent popularization of the thesis published in 1995 called Creating a New Civilization, The Politics of the Third Wave, provides an overwhelming stench of kookery and fascism. The Toffler thesis is that industrial society, the second wave, must be destroyed, and the third wave of cybernetics information take over. Compare the following. Quote, when a society is struck by 2 or more giant waves of change, and none is yet clearly dominant, the image of the future is fractured. It becomes extremely difficult to sort out the meaning of the changes and conflicts that arise. The collision of wave fronts creates a raging ocean full of clashing current, eddies, and maelstroms which conceal the deeper, more important historic ties. Now another author's gobbledygook. This life, whose progression in what perfects itself in the rhythm of rising and falling, in the depths of dying away, and at the peaks of culmination, this life also permeates the individual being. Birth and death seem absolute. In truth, they are utterly relative. What is actually born and dies, which takes on individual form and relinquishes it, is not the individual being, but life overall. Birth, like death, animation and extinction are phases of that actuality. The particular form is only a transition. What exists in reality is the life of the species. The individual is only a wave. Now, the first of these comes from Newt's idol Alvin Toffler. The second, from a fascist mystic named Romanov Guardini, cited by Helga LaRouche in her 1982 attack on fascism. The mystical imagery is one of the zeitgeist, dominating the individual in history, precisely the opposite of the Christian notion of individual man made in the image of the Creator. That's Alvin. We needn't just rely on, we have Alvin, and then we have his worse half. That's Heidi. These are recent photos. She's actually cleaned up a little bit. She used to wear a butch. We needn't just rely on images, however. The third wave explicitly lays out the futurist rejection of the image of man, the creator, saying that such an idea belongs to the second wave industrial society. Toffler specifically attacks, one, the idea that humans should hold dominion over nature, which he identifies as going back as far as Genesis. Two, humans not merely being in charge of nature, but the pinnacle of a long process of evolution. And three, the third core belief of the second wave, that linked nature and evolution together, was the progress principle, the idea that history flows irreversibly toward the better life for humanity. Toffler identifies these ideas, man made in the image of God dominating nature, man working for progress in the universe, as the enemy. And by endorsing Toffler as a leading revolutionist for today, so does Newt. It gets more specific. The 1995 book of the Tofflers, introduced and endorsed by Newt, asserts the following conclusion from the third wave. Quote, "The most important political development of our time is the emergence in our midst of two basic camps, one committed to second wave civilization, the other to third. One is tenaciously dedicated to preserving the core institutions of industrial mass society, the nuclear family, the mass education system, the giant corporation, the mass trade union, the centralized nation state, and the politics of pseudo-representative government. The other recognizes that today's most urgent problems, from energy, war, and poverty, to ecological degradation and the breakdown of familial relationships, can no longer be solved within the framework of an industrial civilization." This diatribe against industrial civilization goes on for hundreds of pages, interspersed with complaints about the so-called overpopulation problem, pollution, massification of society, and so forth. Trade unionists who want higher paying jobs than service jobs are attacked as self-interested, as are big industries. The argument begs certain obvious questions. One, when we wipe out modern agriculture, which has government support, what do we eat? Two, when we eliminate the big, heavy industry that produces housing and transport and other necessities of life, where will we live? Three, how will we reproduce our society? But these questions are much too down to earth, or second wave, for the Tofflers. But they are also never addressed by Newt. His entire To Renew America never deals with the massive deficit in infrastructure in the United States, not to mention the rest of the world. The need to rebuild cities, build nuclear power plants, build water systems, never gets addressed. Thus, in reality, the Gingrich-Toffler information age agenda is condemning millions, if not billions, to death by what it is refusing to do. By shuttling aside the question of producing the necessities of life, these kooks are creating a situation where a fascist bureaucracy will have to impose decisions on who will live and who will die. Newt is no Johnny-come-lately to this philosophy. When he went from Tulane to teaching at West Georgia College in the early 1970s, he co-founded an environmental studies program, which featured courses like alternate lifestyles. He was a member of the Georgia Conservancy prior to entering the U.S. Congress in 1978, and was endorsed by the Sierra Club in his electoral campaigns. In Congress, he became a member of the Congressional Clearinghouse on the Future, a small claque of futurists headed in 1980, at any rate, by a member of the U.S. Association of the Club of Rome. Nor is Malthusian genocide the only hallmark of the futurist Newt embraces. The third wave and creating a new civilization also promote decentralization of government and privatization of government services, call for stopping efforts to recreate the traditional second wave nuclear family, forget it, and urge mystical participation in or submission to the creation of third wave society, where everyone communicates and doesn't worry about mastering nature, discovering the laws of the universe, or providing for the next generation. The only striking difference between Newt and many of his futurists and zeitgeist philosophers of the Nazi era, is his so-called optimism. Knut even advocates the space program, but he does so by advocating an international consortium of private industry, not through government credits. This is a total fraud. The last four of Knut's demands for change are more traditionally populist, but of course also dangerous. The third is, we must rethink our competition in the world market. That is his embrace of free trade, which goes along with eliminating the powers and actions of government to protect society from looting. Gingrich explicitly praises the, quote, moral framework, unquote, of Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments as the basis for his vision of economics. In a January 10, 1995 speech before his misnamed Progress and Freedom Foundation, Gingrich calls Smith's books, quote, the greatest single works of the late 18th century, and says that the theory of moral sentiments seeks, quote, to understand how it is that human beings function and what it is that drives them in concluding, as he put it, that there is a man in the mirror. Today you'd say man or woman in the mirror, and that each of us internally, in some way, seek to justify ourselves to what we would call a conscience. Seems as though he is a little vague about that concept. What he is referring to is the amorality, which LaRouche has often cited, where Smith argues that everyone can pursue his or her own vices and leave it to God to create a moral result. It also seems to have escaped Knut that the American Revolution was fought to defeat the free trade warfare of the British East India Company and monarchy against their colonies, or perhaps he would have been on the other side. In fact, Gingrich is attacking the powers and existence of the nation-state, just as nihilists like Nietzsche and other Nazi philosophers did. Knut's fourth demand is, quote, we must replace the welfare state with the opportunity society, quote. This is a traditional fascist economic policy demand, which calls for cutting off useless eaters who can't be made to work. Post-industrial policies have created the dependency of a small section of the welfare population and have thrown millions of others on and off the rolls as it has lowered wages and reduced jobs in the industrial sector and worldwide. The fifth Knut demand is decentralize. Replace our centralized, micromanaged, Washington-based bureaucracy with a dramatically decentralized system more appropriate to a continent-wide country. What a fraud. You don't hear him talking about democratizing the Federal Reserve and IMF dictatorship, do you? Once again, this decentralization demand reflects the process of a traditional fascist movement. Sepp LaRouche cites conservative revolutionaries who demanded the breakup of nation-states into clans and regions, the better to prevent the development of the industrial nation-state. Knut's sixth demand is also traditional fascist economics, as it calls for balancing the federal budget. It forecasts the horrors of interest payments which our progeny will have to pay if things continue to go as they are, and the threat that the debt burden will pose to Medicare, for example. But the choice Gingrich poses means he's calling for prioritizing interest rates, the inevitable, like the third wave, over human life. That's monetarism and fascism. Before handing you over to my colleagues who will provide more depth on these matters, let me give you a little bit of a personal sketch of Knut. He was an army brat whose father and stepfather were both cold and mean, according to most reports. He was raised in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then went to high school in France and Germany, where he received some exposure to European culture, he says. The last stop was Georgia, which has been his base ever since. Knut responded to his circumstances by determining he would make something of himself. He was going to shape world history. This future didn't seem likely as he was marrying his high school math teacher and going to Emory University to study history. But it seems that he determined soon after he returned to Georgia, after graduating from Tulane, that he was going to trade the campus life for politics, no matter what it took. Knut, who had entered Republican politics at Emory, started as a Rockefeller Republican in Louisiana and had a similar profile in Georgia on his return. He first ran for Congress in 1974, a campaign in which he took on a long-time Democratic incumbent. He lost, but the Republican Party was wide open in Georgia at that time, and he was determined to shape it. He turned more populist with each election, hitting welfare, the minimum wage, and big government. By the third race, 1978, which he won, he had cozened up to sufficient money, including in the National Republican Party, to win, and utilized his viciousness to defeat his female opponent, claiming she would leave her family to go to Washington if she won, but that he was a representative of family values. It was an opportunist ploy for as soon as he won, he began to move toward divorcing his wife, ultimately pushing her into finalizing the split right after she had an operation for cancer. Newt denies he took advantage of her weakness or told a friend that she wasn't pretty enough to be the wife of a president of the United States. But he doesn't deny that he was doing a lot of sexual exploration during that period, as well as earlier. By August 1981, he had remarried to Marianne Gingrich, and although the rumors of continued infidelities abound, he makes a big point of saying he's sticking with that marriage. But Newt tore into Washington with ambition, including the specific ambition to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He became the master of the vicious slur, the maneuver, and the ethics complaint, which he ultimately used with the help of his friends in the corrupt media to hound Democratic Speaker Jim Wright out of office in 1989. He formed a claque in Congress in 1983 called the Conservative Opportunity Society, which specialized in attacking the welfare state. He was known for never sponsoring substantial legislation. He concentrated instead on massive personal publicity, marketing tapes of his ongoing classes, speaking and building up the Progress and Freedom Foundation, courting useful big spenders like press magnate Rupert Murdoch, textile magnate Roger Milliken, asset stripper Frank Lorenzo, insurance shysters like Golden Rule Insurance Company, and so forth. Elected minority whip in 1989 and speaker in 1995, he was on his way. Now, I have to give you, before I conclude, one example of what his organizing is like. In 1990, right after Newt became minority whip, he decided that he was working with GOPAC, I guess that's GOP PAC, and he decided that he would help other candidates throughout the country, giving them the idea of how to win, and GOPAC issued a document which was to tell you how to speak like Newt. It was entitled Language, a Key Mechanism of Control. And it read as follows. It takes years of practice to sound like Newt, right? But we believe that it could help if we gave you some pointers here. That's why we've created this list of words and phrases. And then they send out a list of 133 words for use in speeches, direct mail brochures, flyers, and so forth. Now, they're not just random words. These words are divided into two sections. Optimistic, positive governing words for your message, and contrasting words to help you define your difference between us and them. The good words are liberty, peace, opportunity, truth, success, pristine, hard work, freedom. The bad words are decay, hypocrisy, devour, pathetic, unionized, ideological, machine bosses, traitors, red tape, and criminal rights. Then it concludes, read them, the GOPAC materials said. Memorize as many as possible. And remember that like any tool, these words will not help if they are not used. So if you didn't think you were dealing with a creation of the oligarchy in the Newt Gingrich, that should give you a different idea. How far will Newt go? That depends a great deal on the American population growing out of its populist infantilism and giving Newt and his gang the comeuppance that Ollie North got last November. It means getting people to think.
The task of the people of the United States, as conceived by our nation's founders, is fundamentally simple. It is to do good, and to do good such that others may have the opportunity to do likewise for the benefit of all mankind. That is also the function historically assigned to our constitutional republic, consistent with the fundamental idea of Western civilization, that man is created in the image of God and endowed with the power of creative reason. As a people, we owe, therefore, one great debt which has gone unpaid for too long, and that is our debt to history. One might even say that the account is overdrawn, so maybe we'll have to put to a little reorganization there as well. But I can assure you that the constitutional government of the United States was never intended to have Newt Gingrich, that pathetic bundle of diseased impulses, as Speaker of the House of Representatives. So he's got to go. But to ensure that, we have to defeat what he is, not just who he is. That's part of our debt to history. When you consider who he is, the task is simple. Just take out the trash. His mind is it's like a garbage can. It's full of every foul, rotten idea tossed in there by each passing lunatic over the years. But the citizens of our nation, in ignoring their history, permitted his fermenting rise to power by tolerating what he is and what is behind him. And that is our nation's historic enemy, the oligarchical, imperial, British principle, the doctrine that man is inherently evil. It was against that British and ancient satanic notion that our forefathers fought a war of independence. It is that same satanic notion which threatens our nation and the world with destruction today. And it is up to us to root it out with all of its offshoots, Newt included, once and for all. Many of you in this room, and many more persons known to you, were presented with something quite foreign to real American history during the years you imagined you were acquiring an education. Straight from the hallowed halls of fraud at Britain's Oxford and Cambridge universities. Oh, you're going to save me from breaking my neck here, thank you. You were given the idea that the American Revolution was the accidental result of a nasty little spat between the generous but demanding Mother Britain and her rebellious colonial offspring, who were demanding more tea and crumpets than she could afford. Well, our founding fathers and many of their forefathers dating back to the 17th century knew better. They knew that Mother Britain, referred to by John Quincy Adams as Our Lady Macbeth Mother, was evil. They knew it from Thomas Hobbes, tutor of the bestial King Charles II. They knew Hobbes's argument in his Leviathan that by nature human society was merely a state of war of each against all. Man's inherently evil nature, said Hobbes, must be restrained under a monarchical dictatorship, a notion which the libertine Charles II found quite pleasing when he assumed the throne following the English Civil War. They knew it from John Locke, who declared that the human mind was merely a passive register of animal sensations, that man was a beast. They knew that Locke was the champion of free trade for the homosexual Dutch Prince William of Orange, who seized the throne of England in 1689. They knew that Locke had advocated in 1701, as a member of King William's Board of Trade, that all the independent charters governing the American colonies be revoked, and that all land titles granted under them be made the property of the king, and that all American manufacturing of finished goods be banned. They knew the evil behind the mask of free trade. Yet to the so-called educated American today, bobbing along in the tide of British historical bilge, Hobbes appears to surface as a profound conservative thinker ahead of his time, and Locke even as the father of American constitutional liberty. The sodomized launderers of Oxbridge have worked for centuries to provide a cleaner appearance for these evil creatures, and so you came to know them in their altered states. But in this British oligarchical chamber of horrors, there is one figure, first displayed in the early years of the 18th century, so openly, vividly, and thoroughly evil that no serious attempt was ever made to launder his image. Consequently, he has been hidden from ordinary public view, yet he is worshipped to this day by the degenerate gurus of Newt Gingrich's conservative revolution. His name was Bernard Mandeville. Born in Holland in 1670, he acquired a medical degree at Leiden in 1691 and slithered into London a few years later in the wake of William of Orange's Venetian-rigged takeover. He was a monster, probably spawned in the scum scooped from the open sewers of Venice, where they more politely refer to them as canals. Not surprisingly, his medical specialty was stomach disorders. Mandeville's career in Britain, however, was dedicated to only one purpose, that of prescribing the doctrine that evil itself is the basis for good. In 1714, the year that Britain's Venetian party completed its murderous coup against the regime of Queen Anne, Bernard Mandeville anonymously published his Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits. It proclaimed what became the official governing doctrine of the emerging British Empire, that vice, corruption, and downright evil were the necessary, desirable foundations of a successful, prosperous state. Mandeville argued that man's uninhibited pursuit of his natural evil instincts constituted liberty, that the state therefore ought not to interfere with private vices, and that this seething mass of evil in the aggregate constituted the public good. This is free trade. This is laissez-faire. This is libertarianism. This is privatization. This is the conservative revolution. Mandeville's Fable of the Bees was actually built around an earlier poem, actually 10 pages of doggerel, entitled The Grumbling Hive, or Knaves Turned Honest, which he had published in 1705. Here he counterposes the supposed life of ease and luxury enjoyed by a society devoted to vice, to the poverty and economic ruin brought on by pursuing virtue and honesty. Mandeville describes the successful model for the empire. Vast numbers thronged the fruitful hive, yet those vast numbers made him thrive. Millions endeavoring to supply each other's lust and vanity. Thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. Flattered in peace and feared in wars, they were the esteem of foreigners. Such were the blessings of that state, their crimes conspired to make them great. And virtue, who from politics had learned 1,000 cunning tricks, was by their happy influence made friends with vice, and ever since the worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. But Mandeville warns, if the knaves turn honest and virtuous and act like human beings instead of beasts, then the game is up. And society, meaning oligarchical society, is destroyed. Economic ruin follows, because the only source of wealth is stealing. Profit can only be derived from pandering and extortion, and can be increased only by maximizing the rate of human degradation. Even the broader circulation of currency depends on rising rates of crime. Listen to some of the commentary Mandeville included with his doggerel verses. I shall be asked what benefit the public receives from thieves and housebreakers. They are, I own, very pernicious to human society, and every government ought to take all imaginable care to root out and destroy them. Yet, if all people were strictly honest, and nobody would meddle with or pry into anything but his own, half the blacksmiths of the nation would want employment. He adds that even the growth of their trade, producing for, quote, both ornaments and defense, would never have been thought of but to secure us against the attempts of pilferers and robbers. A highwayman, having met with a considerable booty, gives a poor common harlot, he fancies, 10 pounds to new rig her from top to toe. In this case, asked Mandeville, is there a tradesman so conscientious that he will refuse to sell her a thread satin, though he knew who she was? She must have shoes and stockings, gloves, and so on, he says. All must get something by her, and 100 different tradesmen, dependent on those she laid her money out with, may touch part of it before a month is at an end. The generous gentleman, in the meantime, his money being near spent, ventured again on the road. But the second day, having committed a robbery near Highgate, he was taken with one of his accomplices, and at the next sessions both were condemned and suffered the law. The money due on their conviction fell to 3 country fellows, on whom it was admirably well spent. Now get this, one of the Mandeville ads was a gentleman's gardener who maintained his father in prison, where he had lain almost a year and a half. The father's crime, says Mandeville, was his inability to pay a debt of 12 pounds incurred by his neighbor, for which he had assumed responsibility. Mandeville describes the son's being forced to pay to keep his father alive in jail as a, quote, meritorious act of filial duty. Fortunately, Newt Gingrich isn't here, though I'm sure he's surfing along his third wave somewhere trying to get online. You can just imagine Newt's fake, fatuous, sentimental smile upon hearing such a poignant example of self-sacrifice to keep government spending down. But Bernard Mandeville, the mentor of all Newt's gurus, had little interest in succoring the masses. He spoke for the British Venetian oligarchs at a point in history when they imagined they could exterminate the Renaissance idea of man and the threat of the nation state, that dreaded engine of creativity designed to safeguard life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In his summary of the Fable of the Bees, Mandeville argues that to have a frugal and honest society, the best policy is to preserve men in their native simplicity. Strive not to increase their numbers. Let them never be acquainted with strangers or superfluities, but remove and keep them from everything that might raise their desires or improve their understanding. Great wealth and great treasure will ever scorn to come among men unless you'll admit their inseparable companions, avarice and luxury. Where trade is considerable, fraud will intrude. To be at once well-bred and sincere is no less than a contradiction. And therefore, while man advances in knowledge and his manners are polished, we must expect to see at the same time his desires enlarged, his appetites refined, and his vices increased. Now, to any sane person, it's clear that Mandeville speaks for the Prince of Darkness, denying God and heaven and advocating a dictatorship of evil over all humanity to confine it to a living hell. Mandeville was widely known to be the leading figure among Britain's Satan-worshipping secret societies, which proliferated rapidly among the degenerate financier elite. They became notorious after George I's succession to the throne in 1714, typified by the infamous Hellfire Clubs, and flaunted their political ascendancy following the devastating financial blowout of the South Sea bubble in 1720. Huge fortunes disappeared overnight, along with scores of fictitious stock companies, but vast sums were raked in by the Anglo-Dutch oligarchy and the political thugs they employed. To what remained of the decent, informed portion of the British population, the entire affair had a specifically satanic, Mandevillian character. It was vividly captured by the artist William Hogarth, for example, in his 1721 engraving, The South Sea Scheme, portraying the devil presiding over an orgy of obscenity and brutality in celebration of the destruction brought on by the crash. To keep matters from getting out of hand, the King's Order in Council was issued that year banning the Hellfire Clubs, at least in their public form. But the King's cabinet was also reshuffled in 1721, further consolidating the power of the thieves and swindlers who came out on top following the collapse of the bubble. Chief among these was Robert Walpole, one of the most venal and corrupt figures in the whole Sodom and Gomorrah of British politics. Newt would give anybody's right arm to have such a career. Walpole was pure Mandeville, and he was no small-time chiseler. Queen Anne had imprisoned him in the Tower of London in 1711 when it was discovered that £35 million in naval expenditures were unaccounted for, while Walpole served as treasurer of the Navy. He took his revenge in 1715 as chairman of the Committee of Secrecy in the House of Commons, trumping up any charges he could think of against the Venetian party's opponents who had worked with Jonathan Swift during Queen Anne's reign. Following the cabinet reshuffle of 1721, Walpole emerged as prime minister and held the post for more than 20 years, operating under the maxim which he coined himself, that every man has his price. How bestial was Walpole? Keeping Newt in mind, consider this description by a 19th century British historian who calls Walpole a great minister, while declaring that, quote, politics and obscenity were his tastes. The extreme coarseness into which he usually glided when speaking to and of women drew down upon him much ridicule and some contempt. His estimate of political integrity was very similar to his estimate of female virtue. He governed by means of an assembly which was saturated with corruption, and he fully acquiesced in its conditions and resisted every attempt to improve it. He appears to have cordially accepted the maxim that government must be carried on by corruption or by force, and deliberately made the former the basis of his rule. If these are the qualities of a great minister, it is no wonder that Newt Gingrich is so admired in the oligarchical circles of Great Britain. Jonathan Swift and his friends, however, more accurately referred to Robert Walpole as Bob Booty, and cast him as the head of a gang of cutthroats and highwaymen in the devastating satire The Beggar's Opera, brought to the London stage in 1728. Walpole personified Mandeville's satanic notion that the interests of the state for the oligarchy lay in the maximum brutalization of its subjects. He celebrated Walpole's rise to power by reissuing his Fable of the Bees in 1723, adding a new essay attacking any efforts to educate the poor. In a nation without legalized slavery, Mandeville argued, the surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor. To make the society happy and people easy under the meanest circumstances, it is requisite that great numbers of them should be ignorant as well as poor. Going to school in comparison to working is idleness, and the longer boys continue in this easy sort of life, the more unfit they'll be when grown up for downright labor, both as to strength and inclination. Men who are to remain and end their days in a laborious, tiresome, and painful station of life, the sooner they are put upon it at first, the more patiently they'll submit to it forever after. The fascists of today's conservative revolution have exactly the same policy, differing only in some of the rhetorical niceties they employ. They speak of privatized schools, voucher plans, curriculum tracks, vocational training, work study, manual arts, and prison labor. Make no mistake, behind a Newt Gingrich or a Phil Graham or a Robert Walpole stands Bernard Mandeville. The forefathers of our republic knew about Mandeville, both who and what he was, long before the American Revolution. Ironically, a poor boy from Boston named Benjamin Franklin, who regarded Cotton Mather's Essays to Do Good as the single most important influence on his life, provided his fellow Americans in 1725 with a first-hand report on the Satanist whose ideas ruled the British monarchy. Working with the circles of Mather and Swift, the young Franklin used the cover of a printer's errand to London to arrange a meeting with Mandeville. Franklin reports in his autobiography that at an alehouse in Cheapside, he was introduced, quote, to Dr. Mandeville, author of The Fable of the Bees, who had a club there of which he was the soul, being a most facetious, entertaining companion. Returning to Philadelphia in the following year, Franklin devoted the rest of his life to establishing an American republic. He chose to do good and to fight evil, and we must do the same. We owe it to history.
I hope you'll forgive me by beginning this discussion of Newt Gingrich, the Jacobin, with a little word of advice or suggestion. Whenever you have one of those mornings where you wake up and you feel kind of blah and dull, and you're not really quite sure of how you're going to hurt the enemy today, keep by your bedside Newt Gingrich's Renew America for inspirational reading. Just a few pages will do to get the juices running and get you really moving to attack the evil banality that this man represents. But where did he come from? We can partially answer this question by looking at Newt Gingrich's own self-identification with the French Revolution. On January 20th, 1995, he proclaimed his revolutionary zeal as follows. We need to understand that the scale of revolution that we need is so great and it is so dramatically different. This is a real revolution. In real revolutions, the defeated faction doesn't tend to convert, it tends to go down fighting. I mean, if you look at the Bourbons in France, they didn't rush in and say, oh, please, can I join the revolution? They remained Bourbons. In fact, most of them learned nothing and forgot nothing, and 50 years later were still locked into a world that was dead. I am a genuine revolutionary. They, the Democrats, are the genuine reactionaries. We are going to change their world, and they will do anything to stop us. They will use any tool. There is no grotesquerie, no distortion, no dishonesty too great for them to come after us. In short, and it will have to be short because it's difficult to get a sustained idea out of Newt, the reference point for his self-identification as a revolutionary is the French Revolution, not the American Revolution. And as one Newt booster noted of the conservative wave that swept him into the post of Speaker of the House in November, it was like the French Revolution, but without the guillotine. Well, the French Revolution didn't start with the guillotine either. The French Revolution, in reality, had started far earlier than the July 14, 1789 storming of the Bastille, with which it is popularly associated. It started with the American Revolution and the French-American alliance, without which the American fight for independence from Great Britain would have been totally doomed. For the pro-American faction in France, the idea for an alliance was not merely the product of an inter-imperialist rivalry. As the Mercure de France Daily said in an article in 1775, quote, independence will be a signal for the liberation of both continents, and the people will labor. Everything will prosper. Luxuries as well as necessities will abound. All Europe will enter into profitable commerce with the whole of America and with prosperity. Then America will be proud to have taken Europeans into her bosom. Then and only then will Europe reap the reward for the discovery of America. Throughout the period of the American Revolution, there was a constant barrage of pro-American propaganda circulating throughout France, the France of Louis XVI. And this propaganda promulgated the Republicans' ideas of the revolution itself. In 1777, the Courrier d'Europe, subsidized directly by the French government, published the Declaration of Independence in toto. Another journal published long extracts from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Thomas Paine's rebuttal to one British agent in France, Abbé Raynal, who protested the American alliance, was published throughout the country. Paine wrote, "The conditions of the world being materially changed by the influence of science and commerce, it is put into fitness not only to admit of, but to desire an extension of civilization. Its remaining enemy is prejudice. Perhaps no two events united ever so intimately and forcibly to combat and expel prejudice as the Revolution in America and the alliance with the French. The American alliance with France," said Paine, "is not an alliance of courts, but of countries." He says, "We are really now another people and cannot go back again to ignorance and prejudice." As part of the French-American alliance, such great Frenchmen as the scientist Antoine Lavoisier, a personal friend of Benjamin Franklin, organized the saltpeter industry in France, which not only aided in making France the premier industrial power after 1776, but also ensured that the American colonists' army had the gunpowder to defeat the Redcoats. Personifying the French-American alliance was the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought alongside the Americans with other French volunteers and returned to France to spread the ideas of the American Revolution at home. And upon the foundations of this Franco-American partnership, Benjamin Franklin and France organized the League of Armed Neutrality, the alliance of France, Spain, Prussia, Sweden, Holland, and Russia against Great Britain and in defense of the American colonies' fight for independence. This alliance of the League of Armed Neutrality is the nightmare that stalks the British oligarchy to this very day. It was the aim of the American faction in France to bring the ideas of the American Revolution into Europe by extending the wartime alliance into a peaceful partnership. In 1787, Hector St. John Crèvecoeur and Brissot de Warville, two allies of Thomas Paine in the French Revolution, created the Gallo-American Society to encourage commerce between the two countries, to bring French investment into France, and as its charter mandated, to extend the progress of human knowledge. The purpose of the French-American Revolution, Brissot wrote, was the regeneration of the moral and physical man to bring the arts and sciences to perfection. In his 1782 Letters from an American Farmer, Crèvecoeur extolled Americans as, quote, the Western pilgrims who are carrying along with them that great mass of arts, sciences, vigor, and industry which began long since in the East. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into one great race of man whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. It is this American faction that was the leadership of the early period of the French Revolution, with the Marquis de Lafayette playing the most prominent role. But as Arnold Toynbee, the British historian and intelligence game master, wrote in his study of history, the French Revolution of 1789 drew its inspiration in part from the events in British America. Toynbee has not surrendered yet. Events in which the French government of the Ancien regime had most suicidally assisted, and in part from the century-old achievement of England, which had been popularized and glorified in France by two generations of philosophes from Montesquieu onward. Toynbee's understanding is correct, and it is more significant for our topic of today because Newt Gingrich, a so-called professor of history, relates in his book that it was the readings of Arnold Toynbee that most influenced his decision to act to save American civilization and how to do it. Toynbee's pointing to the two currents forming the French Revolution of 1789 is correct, but he lies in implying that these two currents joined together to make the revolution. In reality, they were locked in deadly battle against each other. The taking of the Bastille by the mob was led by Georges-Jacques Danton, the portly agent of the Duc d'Orléans, the premier patron of the British and Venetian-inspired philosophes in France. In 1790, Danton founded the Cordelier Club in Paris. This was not a debating society, but a political correctness gang. Its purpose, Danton said, is to, quote, denounce before the tribunal of public opinion the abuses of the various authorities and every sort of infringement of the right of man. The Cordeliers wanted a radical democracy, targeting Lafayette, the court, and the priests of the Second Estate that had come over to the revolution. And it is from the Cordelier Club's base in the unemployed and hungry and desperate population of Paris that the terror is launched. Danton proclaims, in words sounding like newts, "It is by an upheaval that we have overthrown the despotism. It is only by a great national upheaval that we shall make the despots retreat. So far, we have only waged Lafayette's sham war. We must wage a more terrible war. It is time to tell the people that it must hurl itself in a mass upon the enemy." And we can hear the echoes of Danton and Newt Gingrich's demands to destroy the legal profession, as many complaints as we have against it, as the rule of law is cast to the winds. Quote, "Those who have made it their profession to act as judges are like priests. Both of them have everlastingly deceived the people. Justice ought to be dispensed in accordance with the simple laws of reason," emphasis on the word simple. "All that is required is a tribunal of public opinion." And so the guillotine was put to work. Antoine Lavoisier was among those put to death with these words from the people's judge: "The revolution has no need of science." The revolution collapsed in an orgy of violence, and France was saved only through the strength of her armies and those patriots around Lazare Carnot and Gaspard Monge, who would later build the École Polytechnique as the center of French republicanism and scientific achievement. The terror was denounced by Thomas Paine, who was in France at this time, and who wrote that, quote, "My despair arises not from the combined foreign powers, nor from the intrigues of aristocracy and priestcraft, but from the tumultuous misconduct with which the internal affairs of the present revolution are conducted. The lack of morality in the method of the revolution would discredit liberty throughout the world," he warned. And the Constitution draft by Paine and his friends was rejected. The battle between the American faction and the heirs of the Anglophile philosophes came to a head, so to speak, around the killing of the king in January 1793. The king had been caught, ignominiously attempting to flee France in disguise. The Cordeliers Club and the Jacobin Montagnards demanded that he be brought to summary justice and be killed. "To propose a trial for Louis XVI in whatever form," said Robespierre, "is to retrace our steps toward royal and constitutional reform. It is a counter-revolutionary idea, since it puts the revolution itself on trial. I demand that the Convention declare him henceforth to be a traitor to the French nation and a criminal against humanity." Paine and the Girondins, as the American faction had come to be called at this time, argued that Louis's life should be spared. Paine proposed that he be banished to the United States. The Girondins lost the vote. Within weeks of Louis's execution, the Girondin leaders such as Briseau and Condorcet were dead. Paine, that son of liberty, was in prison. The Marquis de Lafayette was already languishing in an Austrian prison. The American faction had been wiped out in France. And as Paine had predicted, the optimism which had greeted the French Revolution quickly turned into outrage. The revolution began to be denounced in the United States. Although all Americans wished the French people well, wrote Alexander Hamilton in February 1794, they conceived that the excesses which have been committed transcend greatly the measure of those which, with every due allowance for circumstances, were reasonably to have been expected. They perceive in them proofs of atrocious depravity in the most influential leaders of the revolution. They observed that among these a Marat and a Robespierre, assassins still reeking with the blood of their fellow citizens, are predominant in influence as well as iniquity. From Germany, the poet of freedom Friedrich Schiller wrote upon the event of the execution of the king that, quote, the attempt of the French people to gain possession of the rights of man and to win political freedom has only shown its incapacity and unworthiness, and has swept back along with it a considerable part of Europe into barbarism and serfdom. We know how Newt Gingrich would have voted had he been sitting in the French Convention of January 1793. Gingrich is a classic enragé, following the models of Marat and Robespierre. Gingrich is particularly like Marat, the ancient agent provocateur of the revolution, who conveniently was able to flee to Britain whenever he ran into trouble in France. Listen to this enragé Marat talk. Learn that my reputation with the people rests not upon my ideas, but upon my boldness, upon the impetuous outbursts of my soul, upon my cries of rage, of despair, and of fury against the rascals who impede the action of the revolution. I am the anger, the just anger of the people, and that is why they listen to me and believe in me. As Gingrich describes his mission in his interview with this month's Vanity Fair, he himself is fueled by rage. I'm enraged that a 16-year-old has been cheated their entire life by a system that has paid $7,000 a year to educate them and did nothing for its money. Compassion, Newt is asked? I'm not sure what that word means. Is that compassion or just rage, he says. The poor have no obligation to obey the laws, says Marat. Gingrich has gone too far believing that I'm beyond the law, says one of his ex-girlfriends. Marat defends the barbarism he has induced in the Parisian population as follows. When a man lacks everything, he has the right to take what others have in superfluity. Rather than starve, he is justified in cutting another's throat and devouring the palpitating flesh. Or, as Gingrich says of his personal odyssey towards politics, I found a way to immerse my insecurities in a cause large enough to justify whatever I wanted it to. And as an enragé, Gingrich indeed proposes to bring the method of the British-inspired Jacobin counter-revolution in France to the United States. In his To Renew America, Gingrich hails the Jacksonian Revolution of the 1830s, which he calls, quote, a populist uprising of the increasing middle class that bears an uncanny resemblance to the upheavals we are undergoing today. But his biggest sales pitch of the British ideology of the philosophes is his image of the classic American. Is this something like classic rock, one wonders? America, he says, is a unique civilization. We stand on the shoulders of Western European civilization, but are far more futuristic, more populist, and more inclusive. American civilization is not merely a subset of Western Europe's. In other words, America is not a realization of the Republican ideal envisioned by the great thinkers and leaders of Judeo-Christian civilization. It's something else. But what? Well, please turn to Toynbee. In the study of history, Toynbee is ruminating about the dangers of external proletariats that might barbarize us. Now, please bear with me through this insanity. He cites the problem that, quote, in our Western society's new world of North America, There is today a large and widespread population of English and lowland Scottish origin with a Protestant Western Christian social heritage which has been unmistakably and profoundly barbarized by being marooned in the Appalachian backwoods after serving a preliminary term of exile in the Celtic fringe of Europe. He then proceeds to quote at length from Frederick Turner's The Frontier in American History, from which Gingrich clearly gets his concept of the classic American. Turner, ignoring the fact that the Americans of 1776 were the most highly educated population in the world, with a far higher degree of literacy than we have today in this country, Turner, as quoted by Toynbee, avers that, quote, "Our early history is the study of European germs developing in an American environment." The frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. It takes him from the railroad car and puts him in the birch canoe. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and moccasin. Before long, he has gone to planting Indian corn and plowing with a sharp stick. He shouts the war cry and takes the scalp in orthodox Indian fashion. Little by little, he transforms the wilderness, but the outcome is not the old Europe. The fact is that there is a new product that is American. Now take this American and clothe him in the romantic idealism that Gingrich cherishes. What is this but the noble savage of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the most important ideologue and prophet of Jacobinism? Says Gingrich, "The classic American is an independent, self-reliant, hard-working, honest person of no great wealth or social status who nonetheless has good sense, great courage, and a fierce love of country. Apparently, intelligence and the striving for science and knowledge are not among the attributes of Gingrich's ideal." But that's okay, because, says Rousseau, the chief source of human error is to be found in general and abstract ideas. That's no problem for Gingrich's classic American. We only have to pull out the Girl Scout Handbook and the Reader's Digest of 1955 in order to teach our children the values they need to be classic Americans. And in Emile, Rousseau's treatise on education, he proposes, and this may be the theory behind the package of the Go Pack, whatever, "Let the child's vocabulary therefore be limited. It is very undesirable that he should have more words than ideas, that he should be able to say more than he thinks. One of the reasons why peasants are generally shrewder than townfolk is, I think, because their vocabulary is smaller. They have few ideas, but those few are thoroughly grasped." Isn't this the utopian dream of Lord Rees-Mogg and his ilk, the complete dumbing down of the American population so that the United States no longer has the capability to challenge the oligarchy? Rousseau believed that the faculty of self-improvement is, quote, "that faculty which absolutely distinguishes man from the beasts." He has some apprehension that the capacity for creativity in each individual human being is what makes us human. But then he goes on to say, "It is precisely this faculty that is the source of all of man's misfortunes." It is the wide currency in the United States, given this acceptance of bestialization as a romantic ideal, that is the source of Gingrich's enragé worldview and of his popularity. After all, what else does Gingrich do but take the angry mutterings of Americans locked in a self-imposed ignorance and elevate that to the status of a national renewal program? It's all the fault of those damn welfare mothers, we can hear Newt's surly father saying by the TV. And as Rousseau proposes in The Social Contract, a bestialized humanity requires dictatorship for its own self-discipline. The social contract, which the British philosophes of this country purport to be the basis of the American Constitution, is in reality a blueprint for a fascist totalitarian state. In human relations, there is only the master-slave relationship conjured up by such as Lord Rees-Mogg. If there is any cure for this social evil, says Rousseau, it is to be found in the substitution of the law for the individual, in arming the general will with a real strength beyond the power of any individual will. Or, as Robespierre characterized it, the government of revolution is the despotism of liberty against tyranny. Gingrich would agree. He is the British designated herald of the conservative counter-revolution in the United States.
In the summer 1994 issue of the Heritage Foundation's Policy Review magazine, Representative Dick Armey, another leading candidate for the honorary title of the Robespierre of the 1990s conservative revolution in America, delivered a glowing tribute to his intellectual mentor, Dr. Friedrich von Hayek, on the 50th anniversary of the publication of the professor's most well-known work, The Road to Serfdom. With blood dripping from his Jacobin pen, Armey proclaimed, "Liberation is at hand. A paradigm-shattering revolution has just taken place. In the signal events of the 1980s, from the collapse of communism to the Reagan economic boom to the rise of the computer, the idea of economic freedom has been overwhelmingly vindicated. The intellectual foundation of statism has turned to dust. This revolution has been so sudden and sweeping that few in Washington have yet grasped its full meaning. But when the true significance of the 1980s freedom revolution sinks in, politics, culture, indeed the entire human outlook will change. Once this shift takes place, by 1996, I predict, we will be able to advance a true Hayekian agenda, including radical spending cuts, the end of the public school monopoly, a free market health care system, and the elimination of the family-destroying welfare dole. Unlike 1944, history is now on the side of freedom. Now, I want to make two brief observations about this little gem from Dick Armey. First of all, if you were to simply add on, as Pete Wilson and others have added on, the crackdown on illegal aliens and a much tougher crackdown on crime, you would have all of the essential elements of Adolf Hitler's 1934 electoral platform. Maybe that explains why it is that Armey has a problem with 1944, which he describes as a year which was not on the side of freedom. Of course, last year we celebrated 1944 from the standpoint of the 50th anniversary of D-Day and the beginning of the rollback of Hitler's takeover of Europe. And 1944 was also the year that Roosevelt very much redoubled his commitments to waging a war against the revival of British imperialism at the end of the Second World War. So we've got a rather different view of these events than Dick Armey. Phil Graham, Milton Friedman, and Malcolm Forbes Jr. all joined Armey in the pages of that same summer 1994 issue of Policy Review to praise von Hayek as the man who snatched the conservative revolution from the jaws of defeat at the end of World War II. Also during the summer of 1994, another more secretive commemorative event for the road to serfdom took place in Cannes, France. This was the annual gathering of the Mont Pelerin Society, the institution that was founded by von Hayek in 1947 to advance the conservative revolution by launching the radical insurgency that has now overrun the corridors of power in Washington and in many other capitals around the globe. The keynote speech at that Cannes event was delivered by Alain Madeleine, the leading translator of von Hayek's works into French, and the man who President Chirac just fired as France's economics and finance minister, much to the chagrin of London. Writing The Road to Serfdom in London in 1944, while teaching at the British Fabian Society's London School of Economics, von Hayek was certainly in no position to pen an apology for Adolf Hitler and National Socialism. Instead, he took a sophisticated detour to arrive at the exact same end result. Von Hayek denounced National Socialism as a classic expression of statist totalitarian ideology, and then argued that all forms of dirigist government involvement in the economy strangle freedom, crush the free market, and lead inevitably to Hitlerian totalitarianism. Von Hayek slandered Friedrich List, Germany's great American system economist, and Weimar-era German political figure Walter Rathenau as part of the same socialist totalitarian camp as Hitler and Lenin. Von Hayek allowed his own Anglophiliac sentiments to all hang out as he pilloried List as the principal author of the, quote, German thesis that free trade was a policy dictated solely by and appropriate only to the special interests of England in the 19th century. He slandered Rathenau, whose assassination in 1923 helped break any resistance to the draconian conditionalities that the Versailles Treaty imposed on Germany, and also provided to be a key step towards the Nazi Party's rise to power. Quote, ideas very similar to these anti-individualist views were current in the office of the German raw material dictator Walter Rathenau, who, although he would have shuddered had he realized the consequences of his totalitarian economics, yet deserves a considerable place in any fuller history of the growth of Nazi ideas. Talk about Nazi ideas. The radical alternatives that von Hayek posed, strict monetarism, total deregulation, and pan-European federalism, were all expressions of the same feudalist outlook that produced Hitler's National Socialism and the thousands of other varieties of conservative revolutionism that proliferated after World War I. Quote, we shall not rebuild civilization on the large scale, von Hayek wrote in The Road to Serfdom. It is no accident that on the whole there was more beauty and decency to be found in the life of the small peoples, and that among the large ones there was more happiness and content in proportion as they had avoided the deadly blight of centralization. Prince Philip Mountbatten, head of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, who advocates the genocidal elimination of 80% of the world's population to return back to the life of the small people, couldn't have been more explicit than von Hayek. Friedrich von Hayek was born in Vienna in 1899. After obtaining a doctorate in political science from the University of Vienna and spending the early 1920s in New York City, von Hayek returned to his birthplace to participate in a private seminar series given by the Austrian school ideologue Ludwig von Mises. The Austrian school had been founded by Karl Menger, a retainer of the Habsburg and Wittelsbach royal houses of Austria and Bavaria, who was a fanatical opponent of Prussia's industrialization policies, which were themselves modeled on the American system of political economy. Menger was the first of the Austrian free market economists to explicitly equate these American system ideas with state socialism, lumping Friedrich List together with Henri Saint-Simon, G.W. Hegel, and Karl Marx. Menger trained a generation of Austrian school economists, including Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, Ludwig von Mises, and von Hayek. Before his brief New York City adventure, von Hayek attended the Bohm-Bawerk seminar at Vienna, along with the future Bolshevik leader Nikolai Bukharin. The convergence of radical free market and Bolshevik personalities under the Vienna school tutelage was not as strange as it might seem on first reflection. Bohm's insistence on the inevitability of the collapse of capitalism due to overproduction caused by reinvestment of profit into new infrastructure, research and development, and other capital improvements through the mechanism of credit was stolen directly from Karl Marx, and Bohm fully subscribed to the superiority of the pre-capitalist feudal guild society over the modern industrial state, a theme that Bukharin would elaborate in his own 1914 work, The Economic Theory of the Leisure Class. Another seminal figure in the formation of the Austrian school was the 19th century individualist philosopher Jacob Burckhardt, who would provide the inspiration for the pre-Nazi philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his overtly Nazi successor Martin Heidegger. Burckhardt attacked the 15th century Golden Renaissance as one of the worst events in history. For Burckhardt, the pre-Renaissance feudal alliance between the oligarchy and the church represented the high point of all of civilization. This was a theme that von Hayek would take up himself more than a half century later in The Road to Serfdom and in another critical work, The Counter-Revolution of Science, which he published in 1952. In that 1952 book, von Hayek, reflecting the strong influence of Burckhardt, railed against the two great achievements of the Council of Florence and the Golden Renaissance: the creation of the modern nation-state governed by principles of natural law, and the development of modern science. Von Hayek rejected the idea that the individual was capable of creative scientific discovery, describing this as a fraudulent construct which he said demonstrated, quote, the collectivist prejudices that one finds in all scientific work. Von Hayek devoted an entire chapter of The Counter-Revolution of Science to a blistering attack against France's École Polytechnique, and particularly against its two greatest figures, Gaspard Monge and Lazare Carnot. What he specifically detested about the École Polytechnique, which he ridiculed as the new temple of science and as the source of scientistic hubris, was, in his own words, the École's notion that there were, quote, no limits to the power of the human mind and to the extent to which man could hope to harness and control all the forces which had so far threatened and intimidated him. This he denounced as a metaphysical fiction. Von Hayek didn't stop there. He then argued that the École Polytechnique was the founding institution for all subsequent socialist ideas, from those of Henri Saint-Simon to Auguste Comte to Karl Marx. He then went one step further. He lumped together as leading Saint-Simonists the great American system political economists by name Henry Carey and Friedrich List. lump them all together as part of the same state, socialist, totalitarian current in modern history. Von Hayek totally rejected the principle that man was created in the living image of God. In fact, he traced his own philosophical roots to that early 18th century Satanist Bernard Mandeville, about whom we just heard some things. In a lecture that he delivered at the British Academy on March 23, 1966, von Hayek lauded Mandeville as a, quote, mastermind, as the inventor of modern psychology, and as the true intellectual forebearer of Hume, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, Carl Sauvigny, and Charles Darwin. Von Hayek argued in that Mandeville lecture that the fable of the bees was perhaps the greatest philosophical treatise ever composed. And he further went on to explain in great detail that Mandeville's thesis was the actual foundation for Adam Smith's great discovery about the free market economy. Political economy for von Hayek and Adam Smith was simply the playing out of private greed on a world scale. After attending the von Mises seminars in the mid-1920s, von Hayek became the first director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research. Wesley Clark Mitchell, during the same period, founded a parallel institution in the U.S., the National Bureau of Economic Research. Mitchell would go on to train Milton Friedman. In 1931, von Hayek accepted an invitation to visit London to deliver a series of lectures at the London School of Economics. During this period, he became formally affiliated with the British Fabian Society. He eventually accepted a full-time teaching chair at the London School of Economics. And in 1939, he initiated an organization that would evolve into the Mont Pelerin Society. The earlier group, called the Society for the Renovation of Liberalism, included Frank Knight and Henry Simons, both of whom would also train Friedman at the University of Chicago. It included the American Fabian socialist Walter Lippmann, the Viennese Aristotelian Society head Karl Popper, fellow Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises, and Sir John Clapham, a senior official of the Bank of England, who from 1940 until 1946 was the president of the British Royal Society. It was this group, with the exception of Knight, who died, that gathered at von Hayek's initiative at Mont Pelerin, Switzerland in April 1947 to found the Mont Pelerin Society. Among the other founders of the Mont Pelerin Society were Otto von Habsburg, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and Max von Thurn-und-Taxis, the Regensburg, Bavaria-based head of the 400-year-old Venetian family. The explicit purpose of the society was to revive and spread the conservative revolutionary ideas just recently spelled out in von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. The sister organization to the Mont Pelerin Society from the very outset was the Pan-European Union. Leading Mont Pelerin figures, including von Habsburg and Walter Lippmann, were also pivotal figures in the Pan-Europa movement. The concept of a Pan-European Federation was a cornerstone of von Hayek's scheme, which demanded the replacement of the modern nation-state with a benign feudal system. Count Coudenhove Kalergi, the founder of the Pan-European movement, was himself the offspring of an 800-year-old oligarchical family. The Kalergi branch had ruled the island of Crete and forged the 13th century treaty that brought Crete under Venetian control. The Kalergi family eventually migrated to England as part of the Venetian party takeover of the British Isles. However, as late as the end of the 19th century, the Kalergi's Venetian salon provided refuge to such degenerate figures as the composer Richard Wagner. In 1923, Coudenhove Kalergi launched the Pan-Europa Union, an organization that won the immediate support of the very people who would install Hitler in power. The very first person to join the PEU was Hjalmar Schacht, later Hitler's finance minister and the actual author of Hitler's slave labor programs. Other Nazi and fascist luminaries, including Walter Funk, Schacht's hand-picked successor as finance minister, Professor Karl Haushofer, the head of the Geopolitical Institute in Munich and a leading ideologue of the Nazi Party, and Benito Mussolini, were supporters or members of the Pan-European Union. In 1943, Coudenhove-Kalergi wrote Crusade for Pan-Europe, Autobiography of a Man and a Movement, to set the stage for a post-war revival of his vision of a feudal Europe, regardless of the outcome of the war. Even at this late date, 1943, Coudenhove-Kalergi noted with pride that, quote, Haushofer, Schacht, and Funk did and probably still do everything to convince Hitler of the necessity of creating some kind of European federation under German hegemony. At the same time, Pan-Europa enjoyed the active backing of Winston Churchill, Columbia University President Nicholas Murray Butler, the leading patron of the Comintern's Frankfurt School, Archduke Otto von Habsburg, and Walter Lippmann. The latter two were also, as I noted earlier, founders of von Hayek's Society for the Preservation of Liberalism and later the Mont Pelerin Society. The fact that Winston Churchill was an advocate of Pan-Europa would prove to be particularly significant. Following the defeat of Hitler, Churchill became the leading immediate post-war patron of the conservative revolution and the von Hayekian movement. Today, the entire Mont Pelerin Society apparatus is little more than an asset of the House of Windsor-led Club of the Isles. The Mont Pelerin Society, from the outset, was to be a clandestine agency committed to implementing this Hayekian conservative revolution. One of the key figures in this effort was Anthony Fisher. Born in London in 1915, educated at Eton and Cambridge, Fisher was elected to the Mont Pelerin Society in 1954. The following year, he founded the Institute of Economic Affairs in London as the first of dozens of front groups for Mont Pelerin that he would help to launch. Other IEA founders included von Hayek, who at this point was at the University of Chicago, Ralph Harris, a leader of the British Eugenics Society, which had earlier helped draft Hitler's race laws, Keith Joseph, and Alan Walters. When Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of Britain in 1979, the Mont Pelerin apparatus moved right into 10 Downing Street. In recognition of the Mont Pelerin Society's loyal service to the House of Windsor, Queen Elizabeth II appointed Ralph Harris a peer for life as Lord Harris of High Cross and knighted Anthony Fisher and Alan Walters. Walters was given an office right at 10 Downing Street as Thatcher's resident economic advisor. By this time, Fisher had already furthered the Mont Pelerin subversion by establishing the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1974, the Manhattan Institute in New York City in 1977, and the Pacific Institute for Public Policy Research in San Francisco in 1978. In 1973, Mont Pelerin had also been instrumental in launching the Coors family think tank, the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Following the Thatcher victory, Mont Pelerin launched an ambitious overhaul of heritage, importing a half dozen British Mont Pelerinites and several British Fabian Society members in anticipation of the 1980 presidential run of Ronald Reagan. Also following the Thatcherite election in Britain, Fisher contacted von Hayek, Milton Friedman, and other leading Mont Pelerin figures and spelled out an ambitious expansion effort. In effect, the launching of a new fascist, i.e. conservative revolutionary international. On New Year's Day 1980, von Hayek wrote to Fisher, quote, I entirely agree with you that the time has come when it has become desirable and almost a duty to extend the network of institutes of the kind of the London Institute of Economic Affairs. Though it took some time for its influence to become noticeable, it has by now far exceeded my most optimistic hopes. What I argued 30 years ago, that we can beat the socialist, i.e. dirigist, trend only if we can persuade the intellectuals, the makers of opinion, seems to be more than amply confirmed. Whether we can still win the race against the expanding socialist tide depends on whether we can spread the insights which prove much more acceptable to the young, if rightly expounded, than I had hoped, fast and wide enough. The future of civilization may really depend on whether we can catch the ear of a large enough part of the upcoming generation of intellectuals all over the world fast enough. And I am more convinced than ever that the method practiced by the IEA is the only one which promises any real results. This ought to be used to create similar institutes all over the world, and you have now acquired the special skill of doing it. It would be money well spent if large sums could be made available for such a concerted effort. On February 20th, 1980, Margaret Thatcher added her endorsement to the project in a letter to Fisher, and May 8th, Milton Friedman threw his support behind the international effort. Quote, "Any extension of institutes of this kind around the world is certainly something ardently to be desired." To carry out this global effort, Fisher launched the Atlas Economic Research Foundation in 1981, whose principal mission was to create and spawn literally hundreds of small think tanks expounding the Mandeville-Adam Smith von Hayek ideology. Originally based in San Francisco, Atlas is now headquartered right down the street from here, on the campus of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. In a strategy paper written in February 1985, Fisher wrote of the need to transform the extremist, anti-government, radical free market policies of the von Hayek-Mont Pelerin Society into the, quote, new orthodoxy through the launching of hundreds such small think tanks on every continent. Quote, "To inform the public, it is necessary to avoid any suggestion of vested interest or intent to indoctrinate. Furthermore, increasing numbers of academic experts feel free to criticize government when their research is not sponsored by government." Now, where did Mont Pelerin propose to get the money for this very ambitious global project? A clue to the answer to that question comes from the bits and pieces of information that have come out over the years on what actually takes place behind closed doors at these Mont Pelerin Society meetings. In particular, beginning in 1980, when Mont Pelerin had their annual meeting in Palo Alto, California, the practice was initiated of including in the agenda detailed reports on the progress of the growth of the underground economy worldwide as a critical agenda item at every meeting. The keynote at that 1980 conference was delivered by Max von Thurn und Taxis, and he praised the emergence of what he called the unofficial economy as the growth area of the world economy for the future. What did he mean by the unofficial economy? Go to downtown Washington and look at the street vendors lined up and down all of the streets. Or better, go to the southeast side of Washington and look at the open-air crack markets that are proliferating there. For the Mont Pelerinites, the growth of organized crime, the spread of this culture of drugs and despair, was their definition of financial success, right out of the pages of Bernard Mandeville. And in fact, it's rather suggestive that every year since 1980, the meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society have featured very, very precise, detailed statistical reports on the growth of employment in all of the underground economic sectors. How many people are being employed on a worldwide or a country-by-country scale selling illegal narcotics? How many people are involved in other kinds of illegal underground activities, literally piracy? The fact that this institution is in a position to provide the detailed statistics of all of this is rather suggestive of where they get their money from. The lessons in all of this? Don't be fooled by cheap Madison Avenue propaganda, especially propaganda that initiates in London. There is nothing American about Newt Gingrich's New American Civilization. There's no truth in Dick Armey's true Hayekian agenda. And as this morning's panel amply demonstrated, there is no free market. Remove sovereign nation states from a role in economic development, and all you have left to run the world is the oligarchy's cartels. The so-called Gingrich Revolution is just the latest effort by the House of Windsor's agents and useful fools to repackage the same conservative revolution that's brought death and destruction to civilization throughout much of the past 100 years.
Last year's release of the book The Bell Curve by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein rekindled old racialist ideas that last had their present degree of popularity in the 1969-1970 period, in the aftermath of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. A policy of benign neglect of the nation's cities was then announced by that corruption-soaked inebriate, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan, according to author Brent Staple, has recently contended, quote, that out-of-wedlock births in modern America amount to the creation of a new species, end quote. Moynihan's late 60s statements were recognized by many at the time as the clarion call in the form of the social policy of the Nixon administration for the outlook expressed at that time in books written by several members of academia. Among them were Arthur Jensen of the University of California and Edward C. Banfield and Richard Herrnstein of Harvard University. Charles Murray, co-author with Herrnstein of The Bell Curve, also graduated from Harvard. Murray's role in joining Newt Gingrich, Moynihan, and others in advocating the pauperization of the already poor through something called, in deference to George Orwell, welfare reform, echoed the exact sentiments of Moynihan, who had insisted that it was the hereditary weakness of the black family structure that accounted for the large number of blacks on welfare. This despite the fact, grudgingly admitted, that over 60% of all welfare recipients were then and still are white. Lyndon LaRouche and his associates fought in 1972 a battle against what became known as the Work Incentive Program to put welfare recipients to work at slave labor wages by mobilizing welfare recipients to act on behalf of an economic policy of productive jobs at a decent wage for the employed and unemployed. We insisted that the interests of the entire working population must be represented and defended by those welfare recipients. We said that employed workers must defend welfare recipients as well, because the real target of the Work Incentive Program was not those on welfare, but those workers themselves who were to be replaced by welfare recipients at lower wages. It was in that context that the Federal Bureau of Investigation's agents in the Communist Party began the first campaign to brand our organization as racist. We were forced to make them eat their words, which many members of the Communist Party had some difficulty in swallowing. Was the Communist Party USA working through government channels with the likes of Daniel Patrick Moynihan to prevent us from stopping the institutionalization of slave labor in 1972 and 73? Not only is that the objective fact, files released to legal representatives of LaRouche and his associates prove that an assassination of LaRouche using these channels was underway as a live operation during 1973. That fact is pertinent to today's all-out assault on the citizenry contained in such locations as Charles Murray's pseudoscientific The Bell Curve, and it is pertinent to how we fight this pseudoscience. After all, Newt Gingrich, like Moynihan, is not really a conservative or a liberal. He is a third waver. He is actually no different in his outlook than most of the hippies of the 1960s. Former radical Jerry Rubin, one of the founders of the Yippies, when he became a cocaine dealer on Wall Street, announced that he had found a new incarnation as what he referred to as a young, upwardly mobile professional, or yuppie. Gingrich's outlook is that of the 1960s hippie reincarnated as yuppie. Let's take an example from his book, Renewing America. The subject is education. He says, imagine a morning in a decade or so. You wake up to a wall-sized, high-definition television showing the surf off Maui. This is my favorite island. You can pick your own scene. You walk or jog or do Stairmaster while catching up on the morning news and beginning to review your day's schedule. Now imagine you want to learn something new, solve a personal problem, or enter some new profession. Do you have to go to night school or trek 25 miles to the nearest college? No. You simply enter the online learning system and describe what you need. Living in a world that is bathed in information, too much information for any one person or company to absorb, your livelihood and security are likely to come from becoming an expert, maybe the world's greatest expert, on one small corner of this vast infosphere. You may become the foremost authority on some obscure medical procedure or accounting principle. You may know more than anyone else about the incorporation laws of Zaire. This is the way most professional consultants and small businesses operate now, and the way all businesses are now going, end quote. The fantasy content of this passage then spills over the page into a hormone-driven newt-speak. Quote, the rhythm of the third wave information age will be a bit like rafting down the rapids after we have learned to canoe on a quiet lake. During the transition, however, people are likely to be uncertain and intimidated, unquote. Sort of like taking LSD the first time. At a recent third wave event at which the newt spoke, his opening act was Michael Rothschild, a representative from something called the Institute of Bionomics. This man's opening sentence to his audience well expresses the new age, free associative intellectual syrup that clogs the brains of third wavers. With the air of a prophet delivering a message from on high, he stated, the economy is not a machine. He stopped. The audience waited expectantly. He then concluded, the economy is a tropical rainforest. The audience went, ooh, in awed recognition of the non-existent idea contained in the statement. Only when you understand the psychedelic nature of the fluid flow in the mind of a Gingrich or a Charles Murray can you understand the behavioral sink in which they launder the brains of the labile American public. Generally speaking, the thing that unifies most of the baby boomers, left and right, and perhaps in other positions, is sexual promiscuity. They are part of the love generation, which prefers to feel an idea rather than to think an idea. It is this collective unconscious, perhaps the product of shared experience, including of the psychotropic variety, which links the three-piece suits of today with the decrepit Peter Pans of 60s and 70s counterculture. They are members of the same tribe in the same global village. That is why Governor William Weld of Massachusetts and Senator Leahy of Vermont are so public and so sincere in their eulogies to Jerry Garcia, leader of the premier drug band of the 1960s, the Grateful Dead. This picture shows Garcia giving a concert in the behavioral sink of Haight-Ashbury, California, in the late 60s. His doctor, both then and at the time of his death, was David Smith, a psychiatrist and brainwasher that had co-engineered through his station at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic the middle phase of the government-sponsored mass drug experiments on America's youth during the 1960s. Ken Kesey had begun a mass dispensing of LSD, mescaline, and other drugs in the Bay Area, and used the Grateful Dead as the draw for many unsuspecting people who were given LSD and other substances without their knowledge or consent. They were then interviewed and monitored by psychiatrists and social scientists, such as Dr. Ernst Derenberg, Professor Leonard Wolf, Professor Stuart Loomis, and Roger Smith, a former probation officer who was known as the Friendly Fed. All of these are pictures from the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic circa 1968. One of their more famous patients was Charles Manson. Manson's multiple murders in 1969, remember, were done, according to him, to convince the police that the Black Panther Party or some other black militant group had begun to randomly kill whites. This would lead to attempts by the police to crack down on black neighborhoods, which would lead to race war, which would, in Manson's view, bring about Armageddon. So in the persons of Charles Manson and his followers, the peace-loving hippie, with a little help from his psychiatric friends, became the skinhead. All you had to do was shave off the hair. Without understanding the America of the late 1960s, it makes no sense to talk about the bell curve. After all, its essential argument was written in 1971 by Herrnstein in an article in which he defended Arthur Jensen and restated Jensen's thesis on racial inferiority of blacks for the popular reader. The prejudices to which that text refers were first put into currency in the minds of most people in this room in that period or earlier, certainly not later. We are now equipped to indicate to you from this standpoint for whom the bell curves. There is a racial group the bell curve targets, but it is not the one you might think. In the book, The Legacy of Malthus, the late Alan Chase states, quote, "Scientific racism is essentially the perversion of scientific and historical facts to create the myth of two distinct races of mankind. The first of these races is, in all countries, a small elite whose members are healthy, wealthy, generally by inheritance, and educable. The other race consists of the far larger populations of the world who are vulnerable, poor or non-wealthy, and allegedly uneducable by virtue of hereditarily inferior brains. Far from being aimed at ethnic, social, and racial minorities, pseudoscientific racism has, from its early 19th century origins, been directed at the majorities of the population of England, France, Germany, the United States, and other industrial nations. In our own times, the white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant people who do the hardest work on the land, in industry, and in commerce remain numerically the chief targets and victims of the new scientific racism in America. For example, during World War I, Henry Fairfield Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History, used the supposed round skull shape of the German people to explain their ferocity in battle. We see here a, quote, comparison of the round-headed, savage, Prussian type of skull, and they make sure to point that out to you on the right, and the gentle, long-headed Teuton type on the left, which Professor Osborn says represents now only 10% of Germans. And you see written there, Professor Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History and Professor Gregory of the Chair of Evolution at Columbia University traced the blood of the German leaders back through the wild Tartars to the most ancient savages. Adolf Hitler used Osborn's explanation to account for why the Germans had lost World War I. As late as 1969, Arthur Jensen was still using measurements of the cranium, what was called the cephalic index, to argue the hereditary basis of intelligence. That shows you how the cephalic index was measured. It got worse. By 1924, the immigration policy of the United States was being completely shaped by such false assertions. The borders of the U.S. were closed to those that were scientifically demonstrated to have a preponderance of, quote, Mediterranean blood as opposed to Nordic blood. And here we show you a chart on which Sweden is 100% Nordic blood, Germany is 40% Nordic and 60% Alpine. Ireland is 30% Nordic and 70% Mediterranean. England is 80% Nordic and 20% Mediterranean, which is obviously why the Irish and the English don't get along. And Turkey in Europe, including Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria, is 60% Alpine and 40% Mediterranean, which probably explains the Balkan War. Poles and Germans, which largely meant Jews, as well as Italians, were declared to be inferior to even the intelligence of the Northern American Negro, placing them at the bottom of the bell. They were barely saved from sliding off the bell only by the even lower estimate of the intelligence of the Southern American Negro. This occurred despite the fact that it was known that the IQ tests were frauds. A posthumous IQ test scored eugenicist Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, at an IQ of 200, claiming that he was smarter than Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, and others, who were also posthumously tested. This is not to assert, however, that they agreed to be tested. We have every indication, in fact, that they did not. In 1915, the mayor of Chicago and other officials of the city were classified as morons by the IQ tests. Assertions of racial differences continued despite the fact that comparative figures on IQ tests between blacks and whites showed that when children of the same economic standing were compared, that the IQs were comparable. And we just show you one of those comparisons in brackets between black children at the top of the middle class and then professional children of whites. And you see the IQ is identical, and you could go through this chart and show the same thing throughout. Murray attempts to show that the reason for poverty among whites, as among African Americans, for example, is the same: hereditary inferiority. 38% of white chronic welfare recipients have less than a high school diploma. This next chart shows you what Murray calls defining the cognitive classes. To the left, very dull, next normal, next bright, and next very bright. So that's how you get your bell curve for anyone in the population, not for blacks, but for anyone. 55% of white mothers who went on welfare within a year of the birth of their first child are classified as very dull. Dullards also accounted for 31% of chronic welfare recipients. In Murray's sample, almost no one who went to college was poor, and, quote, high IQ makes a difference in avoiding poverty. 16% of dull and 30% of very dull whites were in poverty, while only 3% of bright and 2% of very bright white adults were in poverty. Conclusion: if you're poor, you're probably stupid. If you're rich, you're probably smart. Murray's syrupy narrative sometimes sticks things together that shouldn't be combined. He and other Gingrichites try to explain that poverty is caused by stupidity, but they cannot deny that since the 1960s, as opposed to the period from about 1940 to 1967, there has been stagnation in the war on poverty. In fact, less than 3 years after the declaration of the war on poverty, in 1964, the U.S. began to regress to a condition that had not existed since the time of the Great Depression. Up to that time, there had been a continuous shift from people out of the poverty line. What are the axioms of Murray's thought? Let's examine them. I get what I deserve. I deserve what I get. I have it, therefore I deserve it. I deserve it because I have it. You have not got it, therefore you do not deserve it. You do not deserve it because you have not got it. You have not got it because you do not deserve it. You do not deserve it, therefore you have not got it. Now, this is not an example of what Murray would call cognitive thinking, but it is a good summary of the true underlying axiom of his and the Gingrich outlook. It comes from the work of one of his and Gingrich's countercultural controllers, British Tavistock Clinic operative Dr. R.D. Laing. In truth, almost everything that Murray calls cognitive thinking is affective thinking, emotionally driven prejudice passing for thought, like what we see in the so-called O.J. Simpson trial. The person Simpson no longer has anything to do with the pseudo-trial. He is unrecognizable to the American people. The subject of the trial is the destruction of the cognitive powers of the American public. What has happened to your mind is similar to what happens to your mind on LSD. Your ability to recognize another human being and to therefore judge the merits of his action is stolen without your knowledge. These are drawings done by an artist under the influence of LSD. Laing composed several of what he referred to as logical knots out of his clinical work with schizophrenics, of which the example we gave before was one. Laing was also the guru of the 1960s countercultural psychiatric movement, which contended that there really was not any such thing as insanity. It was essentially a, quote, difference in opinion about behavior. Out of that difference, Laing manufactured the Baader-Meinhof terrorists out of the Heidelberg Mental Patients Collective in Germany and did other exotic things. Let's take another example of such a Langian knot. Number one says, people pollute. Pollution is bad. People who pollute are bad. Number two asks, but all people pollute. Does that mean that all people are bad? Number one answers, the more people, the more pollution. The less people, the less pollution. Less people, good. More people, bad. Number two concurs. Oh, I see. The world needs less people so that life will be better. So there is racism in the bell curve, but it's a war of the Eloi against the Morlocks, of the long heads against the round heads, of the cognitive elite against the cognitively challenged. In English, this means a war against anybody that is said to no longer count, no matter what their color. Imagine Murray's cognitive elite in their late teens and early 20s in 1965, now in their late 40s and early 50s, exhausted from, or at least jaded by, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Imagine them as the political, religious, and cultural leadership in a world of increasing and accelerated change on the verge of a financial collapse. What kind of social policy will they create? Do not look for ideas in the vicinity of Newt Gingrich. Don't look for cognition there. Gingrich is only a happening, a self-described psychodrama chasing a fantasy. Don't look for any intelligible idea of intelligence from Charles Murray. They are playing a game. They are playing it not playing a game. If I show them that they see they are, I shall break the rules and they will punish me. I must play their game of not seeing I see the game. Is that not the mental and moral paralysis of our fellow citizens, and perhaps some of you? If the citizenry continues to lower its IQ, that is, its integrity quotient, by pretending to not see that the Gingrichites are playing a skin game with the bell curve, then that citizenry will be hoisted on its own petard. And therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls or curves. It tolls for thee.
Well, somebody said to me yesterday, boy, Ed, you're the last speaker on the last panel. You'll be lucky if there's anybody there. Well, I'd like to thank Dennis and the rest of the speakers here for keeping you all here. I'm supposed to talk about the theory, the legal theory or the theory of government of the Gingrichites, the conservative revolution types, which is really a pretty difficult task since they really don't have a theory about it. They have a few simplistic ideas, and as we've seen, if you want to find out what they think, you have to look elsewhere. You could sum up their sort of simplistic theory of government as two ideas. First of all, that government is too big and needs to be decentralized and privatized And secondly, that you need law and order, you need to be tough on crime, 3 strikes and you're out, the chain gangs, the rock piles in Alabama, eliminate parole, this sort of thing. Now, it sounds perhaps a little contradictory. On the one hand, they say we have too much government, but when it comes to crime and these things, then we have too little government. They say you can't trust the government to deliver a letter, to run the post office, to run a railroad, to run a sanitation system. You can't trust the government to pick up the garbage, but yet you can trust it to run a bigger and bigger criminal justice system. You can't trust the government to deliver a letter, but you can trust it with your life. And maybe not their lives, but people who have darker skin, someone a lot poorer, people way down on that bell curve there. So think about it. They think you can trust the government to run a fair court system, to arrest people, decide on questions of life and death, but you can't trust the government to run a sewer system or a water system. That sort of thing should be privatized. Now, most of our idiots here in the U.S., in the so-called Gingrich-Graham crowd, the conservative revolution, don't even see the paradox or don't really care about it. They're just following a script. And if you've seen from what Jeff and others have gone through, if you follow the trail of the script writers back to London, you'll find that there are people there that do understand it, and they even boast about it. Now, Nancy referred it in her talk at the beginning of this panel about Peregrine Worsthorne's column, A Police State Beats a Welfare State, in which you recall in this column that he praised Newt Gingrich. He said that the welfare is an idea whose time has passed, and that, in fact, in these times, the only form of security for property and for the bourgeoisie comes not from think tanks, but just plain old tanks. Now, you might say, well, this kind of thing's been going on for a long time. Conservatives have always been for decentralization, for states' rights, for law and order. So what's new? Well, it's right. A lot of it is old, older than you might think. These are old ideas, but conveyed with a new urgency and immediacy because of the imminence of the financial collapse. As we've heard, Newt Gingrich can dress up his ideas in futurist wrappings, but they're actually very old ideas. How old? Well, for 200 years, the Brits have been trying to break up the United States, to shatter it into pieces. 2 pieces is in the Civil War, 3 or 4 is in the Hartford Convention, or you have the 9 nations theory today floating around, or as many as 50 different states. Our national slogan is E pluribus unum, from many one. Their slogan is from one many. How old are these ideas? As Lynn described yesterday, for the past 600 years, the European oligarchy centered in Venice, then moving north to England and Holland, has been waging war against the Commonwealth conception of the state, against the principle of the Council of Florence, against the idea that the purpose of the state is to nurture those qualities that set man apart from the beast, to nurture those qualities, that faculty of creative intelligence, of the image of God after which man is created. How old? You can go back 2,500 years. Go back to the forms of the state described by Friedrich Schiller in his essay on the legislation of Lycurgus and Solon, in which he describes how the oligarchic form of the state is used to immobilize and degrade the population to keep it in a condition of either actual slavery or moral and intellectual slavery. Schiller wrote about the state of Sparta, that Lycurgus worked against the highest purpose of humanity, in that he held the minds of the Spartans fast at the level where he found them, and hemmed in progress for all eternity. Industry was banned, science was banned, and Schiller says, the business of all its citizens together was to maintain what they possessed and to remain as they were, not to obtain anything new, and not to rise to a higher level. In contrast to this, says Schiller, the progress of mind should be the purpose of the state. Now that was the issue in the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. John Locke's idea of life, liberty, and property was rejected in favor of the Leibnizian idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the Constitutional Convention, a couple years before Schiller's essay, James Wilson described it during a debate on whether property should be a qualification for electors. That Wilson said he could not agree that property was the sole or the primary object of government and society. The cultivation and improvement of the human mind was the most noble object. When Hamilton argued for the superiority of manufacturing over agriculture in his report on manufactures, he said that to cherish and to stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Hamilton's reports on credit, on manufactures, on the National Bank, during the first Washington administration, laid the foundation for what became known as the American system of political economy, the pillars of which were the National Bank, internal improvements, or what we today would call infrastructure, and a system of tariffs to protect the development of industry. This is what the British have been trying to destroy for the past 200 years. Rees-Mogg and Peregrine Worsthorne are just the latest variations on this very ugly theme. After the Revolution, between the Revolution and the adoption of the Constitution, the new nation was scarcely a nation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government could not raise taxes, could not do virtually anything without the agreement of 9 of the 13 states. This is very much like the supermajority idea which Graham, Gingrich, Army, and so forth were pushing at the beginning of this congressional session. In fact, if you take almost any proposal out of the Contract with America, you'll find that it's been tried before. A couple of years ago, I gave a presentation here on the Confederate Constitution of 1861. Now, that was before the November elections, the recent conservative revolution takeover of Congress. But the same gang of scoundrels who were behind Gingrich, Army, Graham and company were already pushing the Confederate Constitution at that time. Now, here was a piece that ran about 3 years ago in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Llewellyn Rockwell is the president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And you heard Jeff talk about von Mises and the Austrian school. Well, here he was promoting the Confederate Constitution, saying that, sure, in Washington you have all sorts of ideas for reform, but I have a suggestion for real progress. Bring the U.S. Constitution up to Confederate standards. Rockwell particularly singled out the General Welfare Clause in the U.S. Constitution as an open door for government intervention, and then he compared the two preambles. Now, you notice the difference. I don't have it up there because it's too small to type, but the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, which I assume you all know very well, begins by declaring that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and then goes on, the Confederate Constitution says, we, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a permanent federal government. Not a more perfect union, a permanent federal government. And then it goes on from there, eliminates the General Welfare Clause, and so on. What else do these guys like about the Confederate Constitution? Here's the newsletter of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, called, naturally enough, the Free Market, in which they say that the way to solve the problem of special interest in the democratic system is to instead use the Confederate Constitution because of its support for free trade, its opposition to protectionism. You could just as well say its strong support for British imperialism and its opposition to the American system. What do they like about it? They go on to describe the elimination of the General Welfare Clause, both in the preamble and in Article 1 on the powers of Congress. no power to tax for the general welfare either. The prohibition of protective tariffs, the prohibition of government-financed internal improvements. There was no infrastructure permitted under the Confederate Constitution. The line item veto was there. Other provisions on Congress's ability to raise money and to spend it. For example, entitlements, which you hear about so much today. Entitlements were prohibited. Every allocation or appropriation by Congress had to be for a specific time, a specific amount. You could not pass something like Social Security, anything else which said people are entitled to this as a right over a period of time. Now, speaking of Confederates, we've had a Confederate heading the U.S. Supreme Court for some time. And when Dennis put that picture up there of the LSD drawing, it really looked to me for the world. The first one looked a lot like Rehnquist. The last one looked even more like him, I think. Anyway, throughout the 1980s, and up until recently, yeah, it's that round head, or maybe it's the point. I don't Rehnquist was a little ahead of his time. Throughout really the late 70s, the 1980s, up until recently, still up to the present time, he's been pushing his own judicial version of the conservative revolution agenda, which is most obvious in his continuous attacks on the powers of the federal government insofar as the federal government has powers which would enable it to do good, his promotion of states' rights, and his destruction of the constitutional rights in criminal proceedings. So that under Rehnquist, even the states and even the federal courts were allowed to simply ride roughshod over the Constitution, rip it up. At every opportunity, he sides with the enemies of the Constitution. Every argument he uses are the arguments of those who lost the fight in 1787, those who lost the Civil War. And Rehnquist, more than anybody else, and maybe Mark Richard and Jack Keeney would give him a close run for his money, but you'd have to say is personally responsible for the police state conditions in our court system today. But even Rehnquist and his gang on the Supreme Court were encouraged by last November's election results. You remember the old saying about how the Supreme Court follows the election returns. Well, in the Supreme Court term that just ended in June, the Supreme Court and Rehnquist's cabal there gave signs that they were considering joining Gingrich and Graham in their campaign to dismantle the federal government and roll back the welfare state, as Graham and Gingrich put it. There was a case called U.S. versus Lopez. The formal ruling of the case concerned a gun law saying that you couldn't have to make it a federal crime to have a gun within 1,000 feet of a school. But this law was passed under the Congress's power to regulate commerce, interstate commerce. So they said, well, this has nothing to do with interstate commerce, therefore the law is invalid, unconstitutional. But then they went on from there, that's not so surprising, to then propose that the court should go back to the years before 1937, when the Supreme Court routinely struck down any exercise of economic power by the federal government. Now, Llewellyn Rockwell, remember a minute ago from the Von Mises Institute, after this decision came out, he was raving about it, saying the Supreme Court has suddenly rediscovered the plain meaning of the Constitution. Since 1937, after Franklin D. Roosevelt's villainous court-packing scheme, the Supreme Court has rubber-stamped statist legislation and justified nearly all of it under the Commerce Clause. The result has been a dreadful erosion of property rights, of economic freedom, of states' rights, and the liberties of the people. More than any other perversion, the misuse of the Commerce Clause has fueled government power and hobbled the economy. It is the basis of everything from public housing to disabilities regulations to farm subsidies. Now, he says, with this decision in this Lopez case, this 58-year distortion seems to have come to an end. Now, in fact, he wasn't reading very much extra into that, because it was clear from the way Rehnquist wrote his opinion, and Clarence Thomas even more so, that they were trying to use this decision to pry open the door to re-examine everything that has been done since the 1930s and the New Deal. And to go back to the time in Roosevelt's first term, when the Supreme Court struck down nearly every measure proposed by Roosevelt and adopted by Congress to try and deal with the Great Depression. So that Clarence Thomas said that this current law since that time, this is an innovation of the 20th century, and in the 1930s was a wrong turn. We should go back to the way it was before. I guess they figured if Gingrich and his gang of glassy-eyed freshmen in Congress can march from the Heritage Foundation to Capitol Hill, threatening to roll back the welfare state, why should the Supreme Court be left behind? Fortunately, Rehnquist majority on the Supreme Court is not as guaranteed as it used to be. With some of the recent appointees, in particular the two appointees which are now on the court from Clinton, they have taken some very, very slight steps back from some of the worst excesses and rulings of the Rehnquist period. And then about 4 weeks after this Commerce Clause decision, with a shift of one vote on the court, there was another decision striking down term limits, which you may recall, which of course is one of the big rallying points of the conservative revolution gang. Here, with Rehnquist in a minority, which is nice to see, it didn't happen very often during the 1980s, they actually went back, the other people in that temporary majority, looked at the Constitution, which they seldom do, and wrote what for them was a fairly decent opinion, pointing out that term limits was something that went against the Constitution, the intent of the Constitution. It had been rejected by the framers of the Constitution. It used to exist. And what was most important about what they did was to make a big kick in the teeth to this states' rights theory, and to point out that they even talked about the national government, which is quite rare for the Supreme Court, not just the federal government, but the fact that we have a national government that derives its power from the people of the Union as a whole, not from the states. So it's just, I think, a reflection of the times that you begin to get some of a battle over real fundamentals shaping up. Now, it's going to get a lot tougher than that. Now, again, to find out where Gingrich and these guys want to go, their theory of government, you don't ask them. You ask their masters. If you see a puppet dancing on a string, you don't ask the puppet what he's doing. Follow the string. Find out where it goes. And Jeff has given us a pretty good idea of, if you follow the string, where it leads. And we find out that the string has public spokesmen. That the publicists for this are the William Rees-Moggs, Lord William Rees-Mogg, Peregrine Worsthorne, and so on. The same people who were the most fervent in the campaign to destroy the presidency of the United States and to bring down Bill Clinton. Now, a couple of months before Peregrine Worsthorne wrote this column on the police state beats the welfare state, which we showed a minute ago, he did another one demanding a form of authoritarian politics that would permit what he called cruel belt-tightening and the bitter medicines that have to be forced down the throat of the body politics. This column, which was in May, this was Peregrine Worsthorne's supposed dialogue with Lord William Rees-Mogg. It was entitled "The Right-Wing Path to Oppression." Worsthorne was favorable toward Mogg's articles, advocating giant cuts in public expenditures and radical moves to roll back the state. And he praised Gingrich as well for pushing these same policies in the United States. But his criticism of Mogg was that Mogg didn't explicitly admit that these would require an authoritarian regime to carry this through. So Worsthorne wrote, he said, the people who argue, and some of the wisest in the land, like William Rees-Mogg, convincingly do this, that the only future for this country and for the Western world is to take an axe to the social services. But they don't spell out the political price in terms of the loss of freedom that might have to be paid for such economic realism. He says, so well, it's true that this rigorous and cruel belt-tightening is going to be required, it's also true that today's democratic body politics are unlikely to be able to swallow such bitter medicine without a desperate struggle. The possibility cannot be ruled out that such bitter medicines will have to be forced down the throat of the body politics. Those who argue that the politics of the next decades, truly modern politics, should not flinch from taking an axe to the welfare state, should also, if they're really honest, says Peregrine Worsthorne, admit that they may also have to take an axe to many of our democratic freedoms. Now, after this came out, some of our colleagues in Europe spoke to some of the top circles of the Mount Pelerin gang there and determined very quickly that this reflected a debate going on within the upper echelons of the Mount Pelerin Society, the Club of the Isles. And that they're actually were actively discussing, we were told they were discussing what they call the paradox of modern times, or the dilemma of democracy. This dilemma being that radical measures to roll back the state, in order to shrink the state, you're going to need authoritarian measures to do it. Now that's the real meaning of this sort of contradiction I talked about at the beginning, that you need, in order to roll back the state, you need a police state to do it. Now, the argument given by one of these Mount Pelerin guys to us was saying, well, that's a well-known argument, that democracies give you weaker governments, and there's no majority, then, for these measures to roll back the state. So you have the paradox of needing a strong government to roll back the state. We have to find a way to have an authoritarian government, but one which keeps out of economic life, sticks to the classical role of the state, which for them is protection and security, nothing else. Sometimes the British call this the night watchman state, because that's all it's supposed to do, I guess, to permit the private vices to flourish and provide security for the vices, and that's it. So this Mount Pelerin guy went on to say that the accelerating economic collapse and disintegration was what was going to force this to happen, that this is what's new. He says, you're not going to probably be able to get this through. The Western societies in their current form don't have the will to do this. Only a deep crisis will make it possible. We're living beyond our means. We're going to go into crisis. And then he said that in addition, the weakness and the lack of will in the Western governments mean that you're going to have to precede this by further weakening those governments, i.e. decentralization, regionalization, and was very happy about the states' rights secessionary moves in the United States. Now this takes us up to what Rees-Mogg wrote a couple of days ago. This was, I think, on Thursday or Friday of this week. Rees-Mogg in the London Times, this one called The End of Nations, just in time for the conference, as I told people a couple days ago. They always manage to come up with these things. This is the same theme with a slight variant on taking the sort of futurist, Tofflerite types of themes that Mogg loves. Here he predicts the end of the sovereign nation state, the disintegration of much of Europe, Canada, China, and India, which he says will all go the way of the former Soviet Union. As to the United States, he says, well, it may or may not hold together. The tax system, bureaucracy are atrocious, but the entrepreneurial skills and technology remain very impressive. But then he goes on to say, the most successful country of all will have no geographical location. He called this cyber country. The cyberspace will be the replacement for the nation state. He says the monolithic 20th century nation state has been built on the ability developed in 2 world wars to tax and spend. You've heard this many times, tax and spend. Well, here's Rees-Mogg, rather. That the ability to tax and spend up to half the national income for state purposes, basically for war and welfare. The communications, he's talking about in the next 30 years, by the year 2025, most of these taxable transactions will be taken into cyberspace. That is a country with no taxes, the greatest tax haven of all, Bermuda in the sky with diamonds. Now, at the beginning, naturally enough, at the beginning of this thing, he's talking about what was going on 30 years ago when he was writing about the Beatles and so on. So it's all, Rees-Mogg's world is very coherent. So, he says, how is this going to work? The bright people, the so-called cognitive elite, this is Rees-Mogg's cognitive elite, just like Murray's cognitive elite, they will work with each other on the networks of cyberspace outside the existing jurisdictions. So the cognitive elite. Remember that in the, I think, last conference that Jeff talked about Rees-Mogg, and he didn't just have the onion curve, that he had called it the turnip curve or something like this, was his variation on the bell curve. Ask for who the turnip stinks. I guess it stinks for thee. Anyway, he's frequently called for phasing out universal education. You don't need it anymore. 95% of the population is going to be ruled by this cognitive elite of 5%. So this is, as Linda stressed many times, this is simply rolling back. This is not futurism. This is rolling back the clock of progress, right, to neo-feudalism. This, the futurism they talk about today, that is the face of fascism today. To relegate 95% of the population to the scrap heap, just as in the days of old, on those original charts that Lynn talked about yesterday. If people don't want to jump on the scrap heap or the rock pile, well, you make them do it. So as you've heard on this panel, it's not necessary to look like old-style fascism, what these guys are doing today, but it's going to do the same old thing as the same old-style fascism, but in new age, futuristic wrappings. But the battle is an age-old battle, one that goes back 200 years, 600 years, 2,500 years, and it's one that we have to win for once and for all. Thank you.